civilians on the ground in one night. That's more than were killed in Hiroshima or Nagasaki in the initial blast. Every night, these bomber streams are flying toward Japan, and it's at least permissible, I think, to imagine that on one of these flights, a bombardier or a gunner, a navigator, pilot, whatever, looked out of his plexiglass bubble as he's headed toward the Japanese home islands and saw one of these Japanese balloons going by. And I can't prove this, that ever happened, but it's not, the vectors of the flight paths are such that it's plausible this could have happened. Especially in the initial phase of the American campaign when planes were flying at very high altitudes, so later they were much lower altitude. But to the extent that's possible to reasonably imagine that scene, what it does for us is to just imagine the contrast, these fleets of hundreds of high-tech bombers flying toward Japan every night, watching these balloons with no internal propulsion just drifting mutely on the jet stream toward North America with a 3-pound firebomb. When the American planes are loaded with thousands of pounds of firebombs mixed with high explosive combinations that were supposed to produce the desired firestorm. The contrast between those two weapon systems is just enormous. Yet both are actually operating on the same strategic concept. Both of these are strategic bombing campaigns, the objective of which is to disrupt the enemy's civilian heartland, not his armed forces on the traditional battlefield. But if you can imagine that scene and the contrast between the technologies of the B-29 bomber streams and these balloons floating silently in the other direction, there you have encapsulated in that scene Admiral Yamamoto's nightmare in 1940. That if the Americans had time enough, they would build weapon systems of such sophistication and in such quantity that we Japanese will be doomed. And that is exactly what happened. And in that scene, you have, as it were, the final confirmation of how it was, as Churchill put it, that in 1945 the United States stood at the summit of the world. So I'll stop there. Be happy to take any questions or comments. There are many areas of controversy in this general story, not least of all with the culminating B-29 raids dropping the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Maybe that's something we can talk about. But whatever is on your minds, I'd be happy to discuss. Yeah.
Understand. The fire bombs that were linked to actually come to North America were the ones that actually killed people in Jamaica. So they basically killed all people, right? Is that what you're saying?
No. The Japanese launched these very, very crude, primitive firebombs on these balloons toward the United States. They killed exactly 6 Americans. And they were largely ineffective. They fell all the way from the Yukon Territory to Baja California, Mexico. Most of them fell in Northern California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho. And they did ignite a few forest fires, but nothing on the scale that the Japanese thought they were going to do, and they had no appreciable effect on the course of the Pacific War. There was a news blackout. These fires were not allowed to be reported in the American press, so the Japanese had no way of knowing if they even ignited one forest fire. And in a footnote to this, that may be of interest, there was a black paratroop battalion called the Triple Nickels, the 555th, who had been trained late in the war for combat assignment, something very few black troops got to experience. And instead, they were redirected to firefighting duty. They were trained paratroopers, and they were made smoke jumpers, and they put out the, I don't know what it was, 3 or 4 or 5, 6 fires that these bombs actually ignited, and that was their total wartime duty. So they got a certain amount of press coverage after the war once the story went public, but they never did see combat. It was an all-black unit.
Can I add one footnote to that? One of the things that they were building, when they were building the atomic bomb, they built some bombs with plutonium, some bombs with uranium. And to make the plutonium bombs that they dropped on Nagasaki and that they used on Alamogordo, you needed to create nuclear reactors because plutonium is a byproduct. So they created the first nuclear power plants, as it were, along the Columbia Valley. They built these things, they built like 6 of them in a year, never having been built before, not really knowing what they were doing. But they were designed that if something went wrong with the reactor, the reactor would scram and shut down the way they're designed to. One of those things hit one of those reactors. And actually, the reactor scrammed exactly like it was supposed to. But they actually, with one of those things, came within an ace of creating a nuclear disaster in the United States where the fuel for making the Nagasaki bomb was being created.
That's at Hanford. This whole episode is not widely known or understood, but to me it is just so richly symbolic and representative of this war-fighting pattern in the United States. Its great comparative advantage was the demobilization of an enormously rich and productive economy, and the Japanese simply couldn't stand up to it. That was at the end of the day, they just didn't have a chance. B-29s are all new airplanes designed in wartime, built in wartime, in quantity. The poor Japanese were trying to stockpile these kinds of weapons before they started suffering from attrition in the war itself. We could take tremendous losses and replace them virtually overnight, even in the most high-tech kind of equipment. Well, let me say just one final thing, a matter that often produces controversy in my classroom. I wouldn't be surprised if it does in yours as well, and that's the atomic bomb. I'm not dodge or not address directly the question about whether the two bombs were justified. That's a deep and complicated debate. So let's just leave that one aside. But when I discuss this with my students, I try to make the point that the controversy over the morality of the atomic bombs, the argument is misplaced. The argument really should not be focused on the bombs as the particular technology that killed approximately 200,000 people. The real argument should be on the doctrine, about the doctrine of strategic bombing, about the legitimacy of targeting civilians in the first place. And the fact is that the firebomb raids that this country conducted for 8 or 9 months before the atomic bombs were dropped killed about 4 times more Japanese civilians than the 2 atomic bombs. The first commander of the 10th Air Force in the Marianas, when he was given the assignment to carry out these attacks, he did it for a few missions, I don't know exactly how many. There was a passage in the film last night where a pilot is quoted, or a crew member is quoted as saying, "We could smell the burning flesh at 4,000 feet of altitude." That actually is a document that was unearthed by a doctoral student of mine many years ago named Conrad Crane, who then taught at West Point at the U.S. Army Academy for a number of years. He wrote a dissertation on strategic bombing, which became a book. And he actually found the document where that pilot said, "We could smell the burning flesh at 4,000 feet." There were enough episodes like that that the first commander, his name escapes me, of the mission said, "I quit. I can't do this. It's just too awful." We're incinerated civilians by the tens of thousands every night. So he was replaced by a person who's not known to history for his moral scruple, Curtis LeMay, who was the guy who said 20 years later that we will bomb the Vietnamese back to the Stone Age. He's not known for the delicacy of his temper. He takes it over, and we begin this systematic campaign. And the after-action reviews every day when the bomber streams came back to their bases in Mariana Island